how did Israel come to be? It came to be through violence, through terrorist acts, not only against the Palestinians, terrorist acts against the Brits. You will remember when the King David hotel was blown up and they killed, I don't know, maybe 100 Brits who were there. And there were any number of other terrorist attacks against the British in what was then Palestine. And then you have the United Nations trying to pacify matters, and they send in their envoy, Count Fokke Bernadotte. And Count Fokke Bernadotte is then murdered, assassinated by a group of Zionist terrorists. And that eventually became a famous case of the International Court of Justice. Now, the mainstream media doesn't remind you that Israel was born in terrorism or through terrorism.
Hello, everybody. This is Pascal from Neutrality Studies, and today I'm talking again to Dr. Alfred de Zayas, a professor at the Geneva School of Diplomacy who used to work as a senior lawyer in the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights and later became the first UN independent expert on international order, serving in that capacity from 2012 to 2018. 2 years ago, Alfred wrote an important scholarly article entitled Who Will Guard Over the Guardians? About the weaponization of human rights and how the West is transforming the entire discourse into a geopolitical tool. That's what we want to discuss today. So, Alfred, welcome back.
Thanks for inviting me again. And indeed, it is the crucial problem. We have a rebellion against international law, international morals, international relations. The United States and Europe have done their level best to destroy what we had built since 1945. I mean, they are in rebellion against the UN Charter. But in order to achieve that, you need accomplices. And who are the accomplices? The mainstream media, public relations, relentless propaganda, New York Times, Washington Post, CNN, even the BBC. It's a disgrace because I remember 50 years ago, 40 years ago, the BBC was at least a point de affaire, you would say, something that you would rely on as objective. No longer the case. And who shall guard over the guardians? Only ourselves. This, of course, it's an endemic problem. It's followed humanity throughout history. You already have it in the sixth satire of Juvenalis, verses 347 and 48, where he asks this crucial question: Quis custodiet ipsos custodes? What do you do if the institutions created to defend your rights actually betray you? When these institutions are penetrated by intelligence services, penetrated by ideologues, penetrated by governments that actually buy the organizations. And part of the problem is that the secretariats of the United Nations here in Geneva, of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, secretariats of the World Health Organization, of the ILO, 80% are ideologues. And 80% have been put there to do a geopolitical job. When I entered the United Nations back in 1980, it was a different day. I was personally interviewed by the great Theo van Boven, Professor Theo van Boven from the Netherlands, who was the director of the Human Rights Office. And I became the principal drafter for the Human Rights Committee. And I rose to be the chief of petitions, also the registrar and secretary of the Human Rights Committee. As the case may be, it was a different secretariat. And we were small, but we were a group of committed professionals. And today, if you are a politically incorrect victim and you address yourself to the United Nations, your communication, your petition might land in the bin. And I'm not kidding you. Or simply it doesn't get registered. You never hear anything of it again. So there's certain, shall we say, consensus victims, politically correct victims, whose cases will be taken and examined and decided also in the ideological way. But if you are Jorge Glass, if you are the former vice president of Ecuador, and you were not clever enough to leave the country when the country turned into a right-wing dictatorship, you are subject to what we call lawfare. And we've seen plenty of lawfare. I mean, the United States, United Kingdom, Sweden, all practiced lawfare in the case of Julian Assange, that ruined his life for 12 years, etc., with the complicity of so many institutions. I mean, the corruption of the administration of justice in the US, UK, Sweden, Ecuador. I mean, it's so obvious. And you have a UN rapporteur, Niels Meltzer, Professor Niels Meltzer, now with the International Committee of the Red Cross, who writes a whole book on the case of Julian Assange. As I say, I call Niels the Emile Zola of the 21st century, because what he reveals is so much worse than the Dreyfus affair of 1895, 1898. I mean, here you had a malfunction of the French military justice. Today, we have a malfunction of the entire administration of justice in the United States and the United Kingdom, in Sweden, but also in Germany and France, in many countries in Latin America. So you have lawfare against Jorge Glass, you have lawfare and coup d'etat against this poor fellow called Pedro Castillo, the former president of Peru. And basically, the world doesn't care. Either the mainstream media doesn't inform you about what's going on, or it whitewashes it. So you don't get to the feeling that the system is corrupted and that the guardians are not guarding you, they are actually working against your interests. It's a very serious problem, and I'm not the first person to identify it. I mean, you interviewed Glenn Deason, and you've interviewed Jeffrey Sachs, and probably also Richard Falk, and many of my friends who have the same worries as I do, that the system has been corrupted, and we have to fix it. Either we have to fix it, or our civilization goes down the drain.
Now, the history of international law since 1945, the biggest change that came was the idea that states, not only states are subject to international law, also individuals are, and not just in super high criminal cases like in the Nuremberg and Tokyo trials, but also for other issues, right? And that states are responsible for maintaining the basic rights of their citizenry, and human rights are basically the rights of the citizenry against the state, right? And for that, we've created all of these institutions, and you name also several ones of them. I mean, the ICC is such a huge example because when it was created back in 2002, there was all of this hope that it would really push forward human rights, and that you now could have a handle on all of these illegalities of people in high office. And it turns out, oh no, wait a second, it will only be applied when actually Western leaders want to persecute some leaders from Black or Asian states, right? Can you explain a little bit what went wrong with the ICC, and what are the institutional mechanisms that aren't working?
Well, the ICC and the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, they emerged at a time where there was a certain effervescence and a certain enthusiasm for international law and for accountability. But at the time, and I was professor at the DePaul University in Chicago, together with Sherif Bassiouni, the late Sherif Bassiouni, and we were working very hard in order to get the statute of the International Criminal Tribunal for Yugoslavia to be adopted, and then to work for the creation of this International Criminal Court that was intended to be neutral. It was intended to be there in order to try every single official, every single head of state, every single military who violated the Statute of Rome, Article 5, crime of aggression, Article 6, genocide, Article 7, crimes against humanity, Article 8, war crimes. Now, there was conviction on my part. I mean, I am one of those who was advocating for the ICC from the very beginning. And in its 22 years of existence, it's been not only a great disappointment, it's been a fraud. And I say this kind of ICC, based on our empirical experience, cannot be reformed. You can only abolish it. Forget it. I mean, a body like the ICC has been penetrated, and both secretariat and judges are ideologically neo-colonial against, shall we say, the Africans and the Asians and these people whom we basically deep down look down on. And it's a useful political tool when you can support your geopolitical ambitions by defaming, demonizing, and labeling as war criminals those whom you want to get out of the way. And of course, that has failed many times, because you had the case pushed by France against Bemba, and the case pushed by France against Gabo of Côte d'Ivoire. And in both cases, they ended up having to acquit them. But these people were taken out of circulation. For 10, 12 years, they were cooked off in egg, and they, of course, could not participate in the political life of their respective countries. And so what it turns out, as I said, is a fraud, is a farce. And considering that this has cost billions of dollars, I am in favor of doing away with it. And my proposal is that the states observe their own obligation under the Geneva Conventions. We take Geneva Convention number 4, which is the Convention on the Protection of Civilians in Armed Conflict. Very clear, Articles 145, 46, 47, 48, the obligation of each and every state to investigate violations of humanitarian law by its own troops and to prosecute them. That is the way it should be done. And then you don't have the suspicion that this is something from the outside, that this is something that the United States or Europe or some other major power wants to do in order to advance geopolitical agendas.
Yeah, but the whole problem is that states don't do it, right? I mean, Israel is part of the Genocide Convention, and it's appalling how it is breaking that convention, not only like with what it does on the ground, but with its speech acts of its politicians, with the goals of its military, call it a military operation, okay, like what it does. I mean, it's grotesque, it is bizarre. And the Geneva Convention, of course, too, they stand there as the shining lights, and actually these states are part of them, even the ones that have ratified them.
It is for us to call it out. It is for the media to call it out, and then to call out all of those who are complicit by providing military, political, economic diplomatic propagandistic support to a genocidal state. There's no question Israel is in open rebellion against international law, in open rebellion against the Genocide Convention, against the United Nations Charter. And the best answer would be for the General Assembly to have a special session under Uniting for Peace. You remember the famous Uniting for Peace resolution of the GA back in 1950, Resolution 377. And they could take action. And one of the things that I think the international community would have to do was to immediately impose a total weapons embargo on Israel, and then to break commercial relations. Breaking diplomatic relations with Israel is symbolic, if you want. But if you break commercial relations, that hurts. And that is what has to be done. And the General Assembly could go beyond that. General Assembly could adopt a resolution under Article 6 of the UN Charter and expel Israel from membership. Again, it's basically symbolic. Also, it would not come into effect because for such a resolution to come into effect, it needs the approval of the Security Council, and needless to say, the United States is going to veto it. On the other hand, imagine the impact of such a resolution when you have, say, 150 countries saying Israel is in rebellion against the United Nations Charter, has violated all the purposes and principles of the UN Charter, therefore doesn't belong in this club. And you kick it out. Even if you don't effectively kick it out, you can also do something else. Back in 1974, the diplomats from apartheid South Africa found themselves neutralized, meaning the General Assembly refused their credentials. So their accreditation to the United Nations was removed. So, okay, they were not expelled from the United Nations, but they couldn't vote, and they couldn't take the floor, they couldn't participate in the debates, etc., etc. And that actually added to the many steps that led to the abolition of apartheid and led to a democratic vote in South Africa. And I would like to see the same thing happen with regard to Israel. But we have here a case of complicity of Ursula von der Leyen, complicity of Kaja Kallas, complicity of Emmanuel Macron and Keir Starmer and Friedrich Merz and his predecessor Olaf Scholz, etc., etc. They are all guilty of complicity in genocide. Article 3, paragraph little e of the Genocide Convention. They're also guilty of incitement. Article 3, paragraph little c. There's plenty of jurisprudence of the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda on the issue of incitement and on the issue of negationism, the issue of denying the crime, the issue of banalizing the crime, of downplaying it. And that is what all of these leaders of the free world are guilty of. But we have a complicit and a compliant mainstream media. And the mainstream media does not tell you these things. I mean, when Francesca Albanese, the special rapporteur of the United Nations on the occupied Palestine territories, came out a week ago with a call to prosecute Ursula von der Leyen, Kaja Kallas, and the other leaders for complicity and genocide. I read that in Al Jazeera. I read it in The Intercept. I read it in Al Mayadeen. I did not read it in the New York Times, in the Washington Post, and CNN, etc. May have been there, but then very small, not given any importance, etc. And then, next day on the news. So it may have been published once, but there's no consequences. These are facts without consequences. And as you know, a year ago, and you interviewed me on that, a year ago, my organization, the Geneva International Peace Research Institute, with some colleagues in France, and we presented to Karim Khan a communication complaint.
The ICC prosecutor in chief, yeah.
And that was something that we had hoped would have some kind of an impact. I wrote an article about it in Counterpunch, and I gave several interviews on it. So there was a little flurry of commentary here and there. But obviously, no one took it seriously. That's they have not taken seriously the rapporteur, Francesca Albanese, with her call to investigate Ursula von der Leyen and the whole complex of complicity. I mean, it's not without reason that the Genocide Convention has this Article 3, Paragraph E, and we need jurisprudence on that. When Nicaragua presented its case against Germany for complicity in the genocide, for basically selling or giving lethal military equipment to Israel, the court basically copped out. It weaseled out of its responsibility to the Palestinians and to the world and to us, because they said, no, we don't have to issue interim measures of protection. Why? Because Germany says it is not giving any more lethal weapons to Israel. It's not true. Germany has continued giving such lethal weapons to Israel and is complicit, but the court didn't want to rule on it. The case is still pending, but it is on the back burner. Nobody's doing anything about that case. More shocking even is the decision of the International Court of Justice on the 14th of April of this year. As you know, we have here, we're dealing with genocide, for heaven's sake. You need fast action. You cannot drag your feet. Already the system is very ineffective, very dysfunctional, because it gives the states incredible time to present their memorials. Now, South Africa presented a very, very solid case and presented more and more evidence. And its last memorial, which I read with more than 4,000 pages of annexes, it was a tour de force. And then the court fixes the time limit for the filing of the counter memorial by the state of Israel for the 28th of July, 2025. I mean, people being killed as we're talking. There's a genocide going on. And the court says, oh, you have until the 28th of July to give us an answer. And then Israel says, oh, no, that's not long enough. That doesn't give us enough time. So they actually request an extension. And the decision was to extend the time limit, believe it or not, to the 12th of January, 2026. So Israel can continue happily killing Palestinians, and there's still no clear condemnation of Israel for the crime of genocide. But the whole system is complicit in this, because Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General, Volker Turk, the High Commissioner for Human Rights, have never dared to refer to the genocide as a genocide. They talk about violations of the Geneva Conventions. They talk about abuses, etc., etc. We have here enormous atrocities happening. We have children being massacred, women, and the hospitals being devastated. We have the UNRWA schools being closed. There is, by the way, another pending case that is the advisory opinion that was requested with regard to the obligations of Israel vis-a-vis the United Nations. I mean, Israel cannot just simply close UN agencies because it just doesn't like them anymore. That's why I'm saying it. It's in rebellion against the United Nations, should be expelled.
It shoots at them.
Uh,
It shoots at UNRWA. It destroys UNRWA buildings in Gaza. It destroys UN
you
buildings.
know,
This is as
there has not been a genocide case so obvious, so well publicized as this one. We get it on our television in the evenings. And then uh, the organization drags its feet, and no one is invoking this uh, doctrine of responsibility to protect, which, of course, is a brainchild of Gareth Evett, is a brainchild of the West. We invented this idea so that we could circumvent the prohibition of the use of force, so that states could unilaterally go and attack another state because they say the other state is violating the rights of its citizens. So we go in and on behalf of their citizens, we devastate the country and we bomb the hell out of them, etc. So if there was ever any justification for R2P, Israel is the prime example. Israel is committing genocide on persons living under its jurisdiction. It's an open and closed case. I don't hear Keir Starmer or Friedrich Merz or Emmanuel Macron, and certainly not Donald Trump, asking for R2P measures against Israel. They're still selling them arms. They're still giving them political support and economic support. And it is so disgusting. So that all I can say is that the United States and the European Union are morally bankrupt. I'm not saying the people of the United States or the people in Great Britain and in France and in Germany are morally bankrupt, but our so-called elites, who are not elites, these are a group of desperate people who are ultimately imperialists, and they are desperate because they fear they're losing control, they're losing power.
they are. The problem we are facing is that we are shown by a real world example, one of the on the most horrific scale imaginable, that genocide remains very much a possibility and an actuality if you have, like, let's say, what is it, around 40, 50 states that stand behind it, that knowingly, willingly defend it, and not only defend it, they defame people like you and Francesco Albanese as anti-Semites. They turn it around and say, like, Israel is the victim, and every single person who died, Israeli or Palestinian, is on the hands of Hamas, because nothing of this would have happened had Hamas never been there. And all of that narrative framing is part of what gives them the political rhetorical power to subdue the dissent in their countries, which in turn enables this kind of pushing on the institutions that are there or supposed to be there to protect us from this and disable them. So the question to me is not how do we call out bastards, for the lack of another word, that sit in the chairs of power, because bastards will always remain bastards. It's like, how do we create actual resilient institutions like the ICJ, like the ICC, or other mechanisms in order to call them out for the bastards that they are and stop them, because we are failing to stop our own bastards. I mean, the Israelis are another case. They could be stopped if our bastards could be stopped, but because we cannot stop them, we cannot stop the others. So how do we do that?
Well, back in the 1960s and 70s when I was a student at Harvard Law School. I used to go out on the streets and demonstrate against the Vietnam War. And there were thousands upon thousands of us. And on occasion, the police came and beat us up. That is true. And a handful of people were arrested. I never suffered being arrested or whatever. In any event, there was a national movement against the Vietnam War. And Seymour Hersh, you remember him with his famous book on My Lai 4. And he opened the eyes of a lot of people. And then we had, of course, the famous Pentagon Papers, and Daniel Ellsberg, and these were whistleblowers who at the time were seen as heroes. That has changed. The elites or the power brokers, the billionaires, have managed to control the press so much that if you are against the Iraq War of 2003 and you're a journalist, you will lose your job. And that happened to quite a few and very prominent journalists who lost their jobs because they criticized George W. Bush and the war in Iraq. And with regard to the Ukraine war, let's remember it was only 2 years ago that Tucker Carlson was from one day to the next fired from Fox News, and he was the most popular newscaster. And of course, now he's still in the internet, and he has a following of millions and millions. But the New York Times, the Washington Post, CNBC, CNN are still giving us the old, many times debunked narrative. It is unbelievable how things that have been proven wrong can be repeated with a straight face on television every night. And of course, the mass of the population, why should they question it? I mean, we are, shall we say, an intellectual upper class who has had the benefit of a lot of education and exchange with persons of discernment. But the average citizen, he has other priorities, he has other worries. He has his wife, he has his kids, he has to make ends meet, etc. He turns on the television in the night just to get a general idea of what's going on. So the television tells him that the Palestinians are the bad guys and the Israelis are the good guys. This is not his priority. But when it comes to voting, I mean, this will influence his voting. And of course, in the United States, we're not a democracy at all, not even close to being a democracy. In the United States, we're always confronted with a fake election because whether you vote Democratic or Republican, and that affects me because I'm an American citizen and I vote, you have a choice between, shall we say, bad and worse. You have a choice between a party that is pro-Israel and a party that is pro-Israel. You have a choice between a party that is for the military-industrial complex and wants to have trillion-dollar military budgets, and a party that wants to have trillion-dollar military budgets. You have a party that is for Wall Street and a party that is for Wall Street. The differences are, well, one party doesn't like LGBT and one party doesn't like wokeism and the other party does. Okay, are you going to vote on the basis of that? I mean, I could not vote in good conscience for Trump or for Kamala Harris. I voted for Dr. Jill Stein. Again, someone who had no chance of winning, but at least I didn't want to blame myself for voting for someone who is going to make me complicit in war crimes and crimes against humanity.
I know, and the state of democracy worldwide, not just in the US, is actually quite abysmal and it's getting worse. And just to drive your point home, the party that is for LGBTQAI rights is the one that says, oh, the best way to do that is by including them in the army, right? And be a bit for the army to be an equal opportunity killer, right? It's absolutely disgusting at a level that is difficult to grasp if you don't see it from above or think about it from above. But the thing you said is also it's only halfway true. It's not a question of education. For every Dr. Alfred de Zayas out there, you've got at least one doctor on the other side who will tell you that you're an anti-Semite if you're not in favor of a empty Gaza, of a Gaza for the Israelis. And what drives me crazy is that the people who argue that that it is the right of Israel to go into Gaza and to defend itself, and it's the right of Israel to go into Syria and occupy this territory, even after Syria has been taken over by a Western-friendly regime, right? That everybody praises. Um, and it is the right of the United States to occupy a third of Syria. The same people, they cry foul when it comes to Russia. And, just imagine, we have at the moment two genocide cases at the ICJ. One
Yeah.
against Israel, the other one against Russia. And the one against Israel and the one against Russia, they're supported by like the opposite group of states, right? And all of the Western countries, they're all party to the genocide case against Russia. And you can make a case against Russia for breaching the peace. You can do that. But
Yes.
arguing that Russia is pulling off a genocide would mean that Russia would be massively trying to kill civilians en masse and in territories. I mean, this is a difficult charge. Crimes against the peace, yes. Crimes against war crimes and crimes
The
against
regular
humanity,
war crimes
maybe,
article.
maybe. But
I've no
genocide, come
problem
on.
with Article 8, which is the article on war crimes.
Yeah.
But the problem with the ICC's case against Vladimir Putin is total lack of jurisdiction.
No,
I
but I'm
mean,
talking about the ICJ
they don't
case.
have a leg to stand on,
Yeah.
and it should never have been open. It should never have been. That's one of the reasons why the ICC has no credibility whatever, because it's a case that ab initio has um, uh, no raison d'être. You see, Article 17 establishes the principle of complementarity. The Russians have shown that they have a system of military justice, that they do investigate violations of the rules of law, and that they punish soldiers who exceed the limits, so that they do have a system of military justice that works. Whereas, and they have said so to the ICC. Beyond that, of course, you have to remember that Russia is not a party to the Rome Statute, and that what they have tried to concoct against Russia is something very simple to debunk. I mean, it's a question of transferring children out of the conflict zone for their own good, which is foreseen in the Geneva Conventions. They are following the Geneva Conventions in evacuating children from areas where they most likely would have been killed. And this has been very transparent, and the Russians have allowed, given all the information necessary as to the whereabouts of these people, of these children, and a certain number of them have returned. And also, there's been any number of cases in which they were claiming that some people were disappeared, and then it turned out that they were alive and well in Germany. So the whole thing doesn't hold any water at all. And that is why, I mean, they didn't indict Putin because of massive killing of civilians. No, no, no. He was only indicted because of the so-called kidnapping of children, which, of course, me as a professor of international law, I say is a classical case of evacuation under the Geneva Conventions. But again, that is not what you hear when you read the New York Times or the Washington Post. And they create a perception that, of course, Russia is guilty of genocide, the same as they create a perception that the genocide that is occurring in Israel is really not a genocide. It's only a shall we say the consequences of a war that
Collateral damage.
provoked by Hamas. And I say it was not provoked by Hamas. Hamas, and certainly in international law, if you look at General Assembly Resolution 2625, 3314, etc., a national liberation movement has a right to defend itself from the occupier. And in international law, who has a right of self-defense? The victims of occupation. They have a right to fight off the occupation. And that is what we had in Gaza. So Gaza was subjected to an totally illegal blockade that killed lots of people since 2007. And finally, they break out. Now, if you remember 1943, the Warsaw Ghetto, you had 400,000 Jews cooked up in the Warsaw Ghetto, and they stood up and fought off the Nazis. They lost, and then they were sent off to Auschwitz and to Majdanek, etc., etc. But you're not going to say that the Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto did not have a right to resist. The right to resist is recognized in international law, and the Gaza population had the right to resist. Obviously, in those cases that were war crimes committed by Hamas soldiers. Those soldiers, of course, are subject to prosecution under the Geneva Convention. But we don't have a case of genocide on the part of Hamas. You do have a case of genocide on the part of the Israeli occupiers. And what is happening in the West Bank and in Palestine, etc., is so offensive, so obnoxious, so obscene. Now, back in 1975, Harvard International Law Journal, I published my first major article on the issue of what became known as ethnic cleansing. I wrote 52 pages under the title International Law and Mass Population Transfers. And this article was very promptly translated into Spanish. It was translated into German, became a seminal article with regard to the prohibition of mass population transfers, the prohibition of what became known as ethnic cleansing. And that is exactly what Israel has been doing, not since 1975 when I wrote the article, but since 1947. I mean, you have the Nakba, and you have the expulsion of 1 million Palestinians from their homes. This is, by the way, a subject that was taken up by the Subcommission on Promotion of Human Rights Protection and Protection of Human Rights. That was back in 1997, after I published my article, like 20 years later. And they relied very heavily on my article, and there was a declaration on the illegality of forced population transfers. So what is happening in Israel is exactly a violation of that declaration of the subcommission that was then confirmed by the then Commission on Human Rights. And it's still being whitewashed by the politicians. It's still being whitewashed by academics. And that is really a disgrace. You did mention that there are at least one other doctor who would call me an anti-Semite and who would reject my arguments. My arguments are very systematic, very methodical.
And
I
and
think it's very mathematical if you want. Here's the law, and you apply them to this set of facts, and this is a conclusion that necessarily results from that analysis. Yeah.
that's why one of the mysteries that I want to solve is how it is possible that intellectual people who are by any definition our colleagues, and you have much more academic acumen than I do, but in the academic world, once you get your PhD, you're a colleague, and we have so many colleagues who have this same or similar education, and they don't see that. They are not able to do this logical connection. So the Israelis, there was this kind of, well, regrettable, I would say, talk that the International Institute for Peace in Vienna did recently, about 2 weeks ago,
Mhm.
an interview with a former Israeli ambassador. I forgot his name, but he was a moderate, a moderate Israeli who only wants a ethno-nationalist state, but not necessarily the extermination of the Palestinians. And
Yeah.
he argues when it comes to this point that it's unfair. It's unfair because when it comes to refugees and to ethnic cleansing, the Germans were ethnically cleansed from Eastern Europe after the Second World War, and Pakistanis and Indians, they were cleansed from each other's territory also around the same time, 47, 48. We don't call these people anymore refugees. It's unfair that in the case of Israel, the anti-Zionists, the anti-Israel, anti-Semites, insist that these people are still called refugees when, as a matter of fact, they're just out and they have no right of return. The only right of return is with the original people from the land, which are the Jews, which is proven by the Bible. He didn't say that. He didn't say that. I'm putting that into his mouth. But he said there is no right of return. We need to do away with that. It's a weird notion, and there's some refugee, what did they call it? Refugee mania, that is being kept alive by UNRWA and so on. And you hear that argument a lot. And these people, when you give them your arguments, they will immediately find a psychological trick to escape into this argumentation. So, what does the international law say about equal applicability? So, if we don't apply the law to the Germans of Eastern Europe and not to the Pakistanis of India, then why should we apply it to the
Uh, uh,
Palestinians?
that is, of course, the original sin of international law and of our system, our post-war system. Because, as I explained in my article in the Harvard International Law Journal, the Germans the Nazis, who expelled the Poles living in the Warthegau. The Warthegau used to be part of Germany until the First World War. After the First World War, at the Treaty of Versailles, it was cut off and it was given to Poland. Now, then there were Polish settlers who moved in, etc., etc. So at the beginning of the Second World War, the Germans said, we're going to take this territory back, and the Poles in this territory will be transferred into central Poland. Now, that was called in the Nuremberg judgment not only a war crime, it was classed as a crime against humanity. And what is particularly obscene is that at the same time as the Nuremberg tribunal was condemning the Germans for expelling 800,000 Poles from the Warthegau, under the responsibility of the allies, of the Americans and the British and the Soviets and the Poles and the Czechs. 15 million Germans from East Prussia, Pomerania, Silesia, East Brandenburg,
But how many?
Bohemia,
5 million?
Bavaria, 15 million. 15
15.
million, and then more than 2 million dead. Now, I dedicated my first book, Nemesis at Potsdam, to this phenomenon. I published another book called The German Expellees Victims in War and Peace. And then I also published these 50 theses on the expulsion of the Germans that gives you the statistics and gives you the statements, including of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, Ayala Lasso, who spoke to the German expellees in 1995 and confirmed their right to return and confirmed their right, what is called the right to the homeland. And then I also wrote a book called Heimatrecht ist Menschenrecht, so the right to the homeland is a human right. And more recently, I published an updated German version of my book on the expulsion of the Germans. And it's called 80 Thesen zur Vertreibung, a book that I wrote in the hope that it would be used for international law, international relations, human rights courses, which of course it is now not in the agenda of the German government, or for that matter, of the US government, certainly not official. But there are a number of professors who do use it, and I think there's a certain contribution to it. But you mentioned the right to return. That right is solidly provided for in the Geneva 1949 conventions and in the additional protocols of 77. They are, of course, in the document that I already mentioned, the Declaration on the Illegality of Mass Population Transfers of the Commission on Human Rights. It is, again, mass population transfers is considered under Article 7 of the Statute of Rome to constitute a crime against humanity. So it's not going to be easy to erase the right to return. On the other hand, as we have in international law, and you've seen it, you have violations of international law in total impunity. But a violation of the law does not create new law. You have a situation of illegality, and you have an absence of accountability. You have an absence of a mechanism that will enforce meaningful punishment against those who have committed this crime. So the expulsion of the 15 million Germans from 1945 to 1949, that expulsion obviously was a crime against humanity. There's no question about it. And several professors of international law have called it genocide. If you look at the statements made at that time by Tito, by Marshal Tito, by Edward Beneš of Czechoslovakia, by the Polish authorities, it was quite clear that it was accompanied by a genocidal intent to destroy in whole or in part an ethnic group. And of course, it was a completely racist act because you were expelled not because you had done anything. I mean, if you were an anti-Nazi, and even if you had been imprisoned by the Nazis, when the Poles came to take your property, to take your land, the only criteria was, are you German? Do you speak German? Yeah, out. So it was not a question that there was any effort to say individually, you have committed offenses and therefore this is the right punishment. Not at all. I mean, this was strictly racial, and you'd be expelled whether you even German Jews were expelled.
Yeah, so in a nutshell, like what you're recommending is if somebody says like, no, the Israelis should have the right to expel the Palestinians because it has happened before, the answer is like, sorry, one crime in the past doesn't justify another crime now, and the genocide against the Jews in the Second World War doesn't justify the genocide against the Palestinians by the Zionist Israelis. that must be the answer, right? And that's obviously what people who
It
do
is
logic
so
thinking
obvious
would
that, I mean,
conclude.
to argue anything else in a way is an insult to your intelligence, is an insult to my intelligence. And but these people have, shall we say, no morals. These people are not ethical. These people are so ideologically convinced that Zionism has to succeed in expanding Israel to frontiers that are absolutely unjust, unjustifiable. And you realize that Zionism, from its very outset, was a racial and religious and exclusionary policy, which is contrary to the entire human rights philosophy to which we are committed from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights through the Human Rights Covenants, etc. I mean, Zionism was an anachronism when it was first conceived at the end of the 19th century. It was already so, shall we say, medieval in its approach, so antediluvian in its approach. And what makes us all complicit is that you had a uh, Balfour Declaration in Britain, and that you had the Brits uh, pushing for this insane racist program that was then implemented against the will of the local population in Palestine. And it was quite clear that that was going to create a lot of trouble in the area. And you would hope that international lawyers would have already condemned that at the time. And the United Nations at the beginning, because the United Nations is responsible for the creation of the State of Israel, that the United Nations would have insisted that Israel respect its frontiers and that Israel allows the right to return. We have Resolution 194 of 1948 ordering the return of the Palestinians who had been expelled in the course of the Nakba. And people don't realize that Israel, its history, its prehistory, is terrorism. How did Israel come to be? It came to be through violence, through terrorist acts not only against the Palestinians, uh, terrorist acts against the Brits. You will remember when the King David Hotel was blown up and they killed, I don't know, maybe 100 Brits who were there. And there were any number of other terrorist attacks against the British in what was then Palestine. And then you have the United Nations trying to pacify matters, and they send their envoy, Count Fokke Bernadotte. And Count Fokke Bernadotte is then murdered, assassinated by a group of Zionist terrorists. And that eventually became a famous case of the International Court of Justice. Now, the mainstream media doesn't remind you that Israel was born in terrorism or through terrorism. And that reminds me, of course, of another book. That reminds me of the famous book by Martin Luther King Jr., a book called Why We Can't Wait. Why We Can't Wait was published in 1964. And Martin Luther King starts a chapter with the words, our country, meaning the United States, our country was born in genocide. And I say, gosh, that's pretty tough. And then he goes into the genocide against the Native Americans, against the Algonquins and the Crees and the Cherokees and the Dakotas and the Mohawks and the Iroquois and the Sioux, etc. He's not talking about the Afro-Americans. He's not talking about slavery. He's talking about the extermination of 10 million indigenous Native Americans who had inhabited the entire continent from the Atlantic to the Pacific. And I had an experience back in the year 1970. I hitchhiked from New York to California. And if there's something that I remember of that trip is the 10,000 of names that were indigenous names. I mean, obviously, Niagara is an indigenous Algonquin word, Manhattan, Connecticut, Delaware, Potomac, Chicago, Illinois, Iowa, Nebraska, Wichita, Iowa, Seattle. These are all indigenous names. And not only in what is today the United States, also in Canada. Toronto means marketplace, and Ottawa and Winnipeg. These are all indigenous names, and you ask yourself, where are the people that gave the names here to the rivers and creeks and mountains and lakes and villages and cities, etc.? They're dead. And at the end of the 19th century, there were about 200,000 indigenous left, and we put them away in concentration camps. But of course, we used a euphemistic term and we called it reservations for them. But they were there, I mean, basically to disappear. The whole concept was to make the Indians, what we called Indians, disappear. Something that, by the way, I always tell my students, don't use the term Indian. They had absolutely nothing to do with the Indian subcontinent. These people have names. These are Iroquois, or they're Pequots, or they're Seminoles. They are not Indians. And we've even taken away their identities. Of course, they have somewhat recovered since then. But there are about 2-3 million now, indigenous in America. But it's been, I mean, one of these great tragedies of history, because you cannot reconstruct their culture, you cannot reconstruct their traditions, etc.
No.
I mean, we killed their buffalo and we burnt their crops and we burnt their villages and we massacred women and children. But then in the legend, in the myth of the American West, and that's where I was brought up in Chicago. I mean, we were by definition the good guys. Obviously, the cowboys were the good guys, and obviously the Indians were the bad guys. And you know that a myth dies hard. If you've been brought up with all of these myths,
Yeah.
it takes a long time to realize that you've been manipulated.
Which really then begs the question, how do we expect the people who did this, either the ones in Europe or the Europeans who went abroad, how do we expect those people to prevent other people who they look at them as themselves? And it's no coincidence that all these people are white and all of these people have like European names in the Zionists in Israel. It's no coincidence, not at all. But do you know what is the last stage of genocide to me? The final stage. The
Yeah.
final stage is email footers that say, I hereby recognize that this is indigenous land and we blah, 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 blah. Because 150, 200 years later, that's then, that's when you wash your hands, because no more guilt. And obviously no guilt on the part of the people who never took part in this, right? But that's why genocide can be an intergenerational crime. And I have no idea how to approach that.
Well, again, we have these so-called apologies.
Mm,
The first important apology was done by Kevin Rudd of Australia, who issued an apology to the Aborigines of Australia. And Australia has made actually quite an interesting effort to rehabilitate the Aborigines. Of course, they killed 99% of them. And the last Aborigine in Tasmania was died away in 1888. But and they did not die of disease. Huh? As the case may be, the some circles in Australia have recognized the magnitude of the crime, and you have actually Australian courts giving the land back to the indigenous, so that whole areas of Australia today are being administered by the Aborigines. The whole Kakadu, where I have been, the whole area of Uluru, where I have also been, and they've given back their names, their original names. And in the United States, we have the opposite. We have retrogression. Um, President Trump decided that it shouldn't be called Mount Denali in Alaska, which is the highest mountain in the territory claimed by the United States. Now it is Mount McKinley. So you take away the indigenous identity of this mountain, this sacred mountain for the indigenous of Alaska. But then you have what we would like to call, now we're talking about mountains, the Himalayan hypocrisy of President Bill Clinton. Back in 1993, he issued an apology to the people of Hawaii. Because in 1893, exactly 100 years before, the United States, or rather United States interests and United States businessmen and military people
Mr. Dole.
overthrew the legitimate kingdom, the government, which was a kingdom, of Hawaii. It was a recognized government, a recognized state with relations with 43 other countries. It was a country that was a founding member of the Universal Postal Union, for instance. And we came in and said, we want it for ourselves, strategically and otherwise. So there is a recognition of the violation of international law, of the injustice committed against the Hawaiian people. But then there's this famous last paragraph of the resolution. It says that this resolution does not constitute an admission of guilt, and does not cannot serve as a base for any legal claim against the United States. So meaning we stole it fair and square. We stole it and we're keeping it.
Did you watch my video with David Tsai, who makes the legal argument that in fact since the United States never legally incorporated Hawaii, it did so against its own statutes, and it did so against international law. So in fact, Hawaii has been under 130 years of occupation, and the state of occupation is actually continuing. And he's trying to make that argument, and has managed to convince one of the courts to actually admit the Kingdom of Hawaii as a plaintiff. I forgot which court.
I think was the Permanent Court of Arbitration.
Permanent Court of Arbitration, right? And
now I co-wrote a memorandum on Hawaii, calling for a review and revisiting of the 1958, rather 1959 resolution of the General Assembly, 1469, because that resolution was based on a fraud. The United States had fraudulently informed the United Nations, the General Assembly, that the people of Hawaii had decided that they wanted to be part of the United States. Now, that was based on a completely fraudulent referendum in which the only question was, do you want to be a state of the United Nations? And in which they allowed the American military in Hawaii to vote, all the American settlers to vote. They intimidated the Hawaiians not to vote. And same thing happened in Alaska, by the way. I mean, Alaska, they'd give the American soldier $10. So go and have a nice night in the town, and but do vote for. I mean, imagine having the occupying army voting to justify the incorporation of that territory into the United States. So you have here really an open fraud against the United Nations.
But
I think this resolution 1469, I'm going to send it to you.
yeah,
Send you the
please.
memo.
But
This
Alfred, I mean, isn't it nice that this is the same people who tell us that the referendum in Crimea is a fraud and cannot be recognized?
well,
Hey, uh,
no, it boggles the imagination. That's why I called it Himalayan hypocrisy on the part of our leaders, because I must say I've been in Crimea. I was the representative of the Secretary General for the elections in Ukraine in 1994. That was the parliamentary elections in March and the presidential elections in June. And obviously, I went to Simferopol, and obviously, I went to the to present my credentials to the then president of the Autonomous Republic of Crimea, and I crisscrossed the country. And obviously, these people were Russian, and obviously, these people felt Russian. And if had there been a referendum in 1991, I have no doubt whatever that they would have voted in favor of remaining with the Soviet Union, remaining with Russia, and not being part of the Ukraine, because 75% of the population is Russian. There were maybe 11% Ukrainians, basically settlers. And there were, of course, the original population, the poor Tatars. I mean, Stalin, who was a mega criminal, Stalin had deported the native Tatar population to Uzbekistan. But that is something that the Soviet Union did. It's not something that the Tsar had done or something that Catherine the Great had done. This is a crime of the Soviet Union. As the case may be, the referendum in Crimea in 2014 was entirely legitimate. Entirely legitimate. It was legal. The United Nations was invited to come to monitor. The OSCE was invited. The EU was invited, and they refused to go because they didn't want to grant it any kind of legitimacy, meaning it's a complete violation of the UN Charter itself, because the UN Charter provides for the right of self-determination, Articles 1, Article 55, the entire Chapter 11, the entire Chapter 12 is self-determination. So it's one of those building blocks of the United Nations system, and the United Nations refused to go and monitor. So I can say from my personal experience in Crimea that these people were overwhelmingly Russian and were overwhelmingly in favor of separating from Ukraine. And then when they talk about annexation, it was not an annexation. In international law, annexation means when a country invades another, occupies another against the will of the population, and then tries to incorporate it. Classical example, the Golan Heights. The Golan Heights were illegally annexed by Israel. But what happened in Crimea is that Crimea became independent, and then Crimea, after its declaration of independence, takes a sovereign act and asks the Russian Duma to be reincorporated into Russia because it had always been part of Russia. It was only that Khrushchev had this idea of administratively transferring Crimea to the Ukrainian oblast, taking it out of the Russian oblast. The old problem is that back in the 50s, 60s, I mean, everything was Soviet Union. Everything was decided in Moscow. Nothing was decided in Kiev. So for the population of Crimea, it meant nothing. There was no change. And so the whole narrative we get, and when we hear this hopeless Kaja Kallas, or we hear Ursula von der Leyen saying that they will never recognize Russian sovereignty over Crimea, all I can say is sorry, that means that you are rejecting the right of self-determination of the people of Crimea, or for that matter, the right of self-determination of the people of Lugansk, and of the people of Slaviansk, and of the people of Zaporizhia and Kherson. I mean, the only people who have a right to determine their future, or to determine their appartenance, is the people who are living there. We have nothing to say about it.
And that is the principle that they defend when it comes to the Albanians in Kosovo, but it's a principle that they do not defend when it comes to the Serbs living in Kosovo. It's the selective picking and choosing of the West is the most grotesque thing, and it goes hand in hand with lawfare. It goes hand in hand with the abuse of rhetoric and of concepts. And we are running out of time, my friend.
I know, but again,
it needs to be pointed out and decried. So.
I don't give up optimism. There are decent people around.
Mm-hmm.
John Mersheimer is one. Francis Boyle, who passed away in January this year, great man. I knew him. I respected him very highly. He has written important books. Now, my friend Ilan Pape, with whom I have been on panels, this is his book on Israel propaganda. And he has another book here together with Noam Chomsky, Gaza in Crisis. By the way, just to show you, signed by Noam and signed by Ilan. These are people who have had the privilege of knowing. I mean, they're fantastic people around, including Norman Finkelstein. Norman was the most popular professor at the University of DePaul in Chicago, where I was also professor. And he was denied tenure. Why? Because AIPAC and Maybrit and Alan Dershowitz launched a campaign against the university and actually blackmailed the university. He said, we will make sure you don't get any donations from anybody if you give this man tenure. And here's another great guy, Noam Chomsky with his manufacturing consent. These are milestones. These are books that should have had an impact, but there are facts without consequences, and they're books without follow-up. Now, one of the newest popular publications that I want to recommend is this one. My friend Richard Falk and Hans von Sponeck, Liberating the United Nations. I mean, there's a lot of people who are giving concrete, pragmatic, implementable solutions. They're not belly aching. They're actually telling you, we have the diagnosis, you know the diagnosis too. This is the way we can fix it. That is what we're trying to do.
Yeah. And that is what we will continue talking about until it is fixed. And if it takes another 300 or 400 years, this car is fixable. Alfred, I will have you on back on this channel again. This was a big tour de force. Last book, Building a Just World Order by Alfred de Zayas. Everybody, please get yourself a copy and get in touch with me if you want to get in touch with Alfred. Alfred de Zayas, thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you very much. Pleasure.